Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the second part of Shared Lessons, an intro to urban ecology, ecological connectivity, and data-driven design. My name is Matilde Marengo, and together with my colleague, Japoneri, we've put together these resources for you. I'm going to give a little recap on what is the context we're working within. So we're working within the context of planetary urbanization, where urbanization, in fact, is one of the main threats to fine ecological balances. In particular, we're working within a context where landscape fragmentation has highly detrimented or deteriorated the capacity of ecosystems to ensure habitat resilience. So we begin to ask ourselves, who are we designing cities for today? As John Thakara discusses in How to Thrive in the Next Economy, Designing Tomorrow's World Today, what we see is that the way in which the territory has been managed up until now is incredibly human-centered and has in fact created or deteriorated or created a condition of deterioration and further enhanced landscape fragmentation. In particular, the great majority of today's legal systems only protects the rights of humans, often considering nature as one of the resources to be exploited for the exclusive benefit of our own species. Although this legal condition has begun to shift with the emergence of several national and international conventions, the modus operandi applied until this shift has created a condition whereby land and ecology, through property laws, have been fragmented. A condition which is in profound contradiction to ecological principles of wholeness and interconnection. So we're interested in asking ourselves or understanding how we can design cities in symbiosis between human and ecological forces. In particular, through the application and development of concepts such as renaturing and rewilding, what we want to understand is how we can enable nature or ecology to be able to thrive independently, but function in symbiosis with us. So this offers an unprecedented challenge for designers, and that's to deal with and confront itself with landscape under a dynamic, collective, multidisciplinary, and multi-scalar perspective. So in order to be able to do this, we've put together a series of frameworks or approaches that enable to design cities in symbiosis, specifically looking at renaturing and rewilding processes as more than human design strategies. If we start with renaturing, what we're looking at is in some way the inverse process of denaturation. So what we're aiming for is in some way an ecological restoration, but we're not just aiming to restore the ecology, but enable it to thrive once again. So I'm going to play a video now on the importance of nature and biodiversity.
Biodiversity is a variety of life, as we saw in this video. There are thought to be 8.7 million species on planet Earth, and as we saw in this video, biodiversity is of utmost importance to humans. The loss of one key species can have a detrimental impact on many levels, from other species of animals to plants to the physical environment, as shown by wolves. Human activities are reducing biodiversity. Our future depends upon maintaining a good level of biodiversity, and so we need to start taking measures to try and stop the reduction. In this video, we're going to look at how humans are negatively impacting biodiversity. Here are some of the main human-induced threats facing biodiversity. As the world population has grown from 1.5 billion in 1900 to nearly 7.5 billion people today, unsurprisingly, the land use has changed. Habitats have been destroyed in favor of agriculture, forestry, fishing, urbanization, and manufacturing. Unsurprisingly, habitat loss has greatly reduced the species richness. Habitat fragmentation has also meant that populations have been split into smaller subunits, which then, when faced by challenging circumstances, have not been able to adapt and survive.
As you can see in the presentation, there is the link to the entire video please feel free to go and check it out, as well as further reading that's made available here. So rewilding is a progressive approach to conservation. In some way, it allows to function with nature's own systems or nature's own rhythms. In fact, rewilding is about, in some way, nature's own ways. So nature knows best when it comes to survival and self-governance. It's also about bringing back wildlife. Rewilding works to restore lost species, enabling them to thrive. It also allows us to ensure well-being, meaning that if nature is healthy, we are healthier too. And it also enables us to deliver for the future. So there's no defined end to rewilding strategies. Some rewilding groups or collectives that already exist are Rewilding Europe, and they're looking at pioneering approaches to nature recovery. I invite you to go check out the platform. They have a lot of interesting principles to rewilding, but as well as collecting a series of projects that can be interesting case studies for some of you. We also have, on a more local level, the Reserva Biológica de Doñana, where the rewilding approaches have been put in place. Once again, local, to Spain. Once again, I invite you to go and check these out and understand what are the pros, but also the risks and challenges of working with some of these approaches. In order to give you a little bit more of an understanding of what is rewilding, we've got, once again, a brief video that was presented on The Guardian. Once again, we have the link below, as well as some further reading.
Rewilding means reversing the destruction of the natural world and attempting a mass restoration of ecosystems. Why is it that trees are so amazingly resilient that you can smash them, you can twist them and splinter them, but they still come bounding back? And why is it that understory trees like box and holly and yew are so much tougher than the big trees like oak and beech and ash in the forest canopy? I think the same answer applies to both, and that is elephants. Does that sound crazy? I'm sure it does, but elephants were everywhere. Our ecosystem was dominated by giant straight-tusked elephants, and if trees could not resist them, they would be wiped out. And the elephants in Britain, they were driven out by the ice into southern Europe, and they persisted there till about 40,000 years ago. So did rhinos and hippos. Lions and hyenas lasted much longer, but they were all eventually wiped out by human hunters. We live in a shadowland, in a dim, flattened relic of what there once was. And rewilding offers us this fantastic opportunity to start restoring systems, or allowing them to restore themselves. I see it as reintroducing missing plants and animals, then stepping back and letting nature get on with it. One estimate suggests that between 2000 and 2030, around 30 million hectares of land will be vacated by farmers. And that's an area the size of Poland. So maybe we're being a bit unambitious if we're talking about just wolves and lynx and bison and boar and beavers, which are already spreading fast across Europe. Perhaps we should also be thinking about bringing back some of the lost megafauna. It seems to me that rewilding offers us more than just the restoration of the ecosystem. It brings back into our lives a lot of thrill and wonder and enchantment. And wouldn't it be amazing if everybody had a Serengeti on their doorstep? Rewilding the ecosystem offers us a chance to rewild our own lives as well.
So We'll give you a couple of examples now of how we've been working with renaturing and also later on rewilding within the context of the projects that we've been developing. So starting off with renaturing cities, understanding how we can steer territorial dynamics through working with river systems. So we're looking at integrating territorial forces into urban design. And basically, in order to be able to do this, we're working with simulation and digital models that can enable in some way designers to be able to foresee the evolution of territorial dynamics related to natural forces rather than limiting them. So designing with these territorial forces. In particular, we're going to be looking at an example developed in Luxembourg with the Alzette River, looking at enhancing the river's natural state and functioning in order to be able to tackle issues of loss of habitat produced by human-induced modifications. We also have a series of issues of pollution, and what we're working with is the river meanders. So this is the Alzette River, and together with the students that were working on this topic, we identified a series of spaces along the river that were particularly urbanized in different ways and that therefore had an impact on the river's capacity to adapt according to the quantity of water flow. With this in mind, we were able to simulate the river's behavior over a long period of time and taking into consideration the possibility or the river's reaction if the water was much. So, for example, if there's a large amount of precipitation or another uncontrolled environmental condition, which would mean that the river then had to overflow. We were also able to simulate and understand what would be the impacts of this overflow. Once this has been done, we look into a series of approaches that enable us to work with the river and not against the river, not containing the river, but rather embracing the river as a natural system and enabling us to create a series of interventions within the river's system for the river's system in order to enable it to react and respond to different water conditions. As you can see, going back, we were working with meandering patterns. So looking at creating or widening the flow of the river for it to react. Bioremediation forest, so working with the porosity of the land, the capacity of the plants to be able to reduce the pollutants within the water, and also recreational areas in order to enhance the awareness of humans towards the benefits and the interest in these natural systems, as well as creating spaces for this interaction. So once the proposal has been developed based on the simulations of the areas that are of particular risk, what we have is the capacity to enable the development of a plan. This system works between environmental, economic, and social forces, enabling the possibility to, on one side, organize interventions, but also plan physical interventions that allow to improve biodiversity and in some way work together with the citizens within the space by selecting and planting the species together with the citizens for the bioremediation processes, creating also other resources and other ecosystem services that these systems can provide. In relation to rewilding cities, we have looked at the different possibilities of working with ecosystem engineers and keystone species, in order to enable a series of implementations. So in some way, we're looking at the possibility of mending fragmented landscapes through ecological connectivity, and we're enabling this ecological connectivity thanks to the possibility of working hand in hand with keystone species. This allows us to, in some way, work on one side for the survival of wild animals and plant species, but also to ensure ecological connectivity. So the first project, this allows us in some way to respond to some of the challenges that we see in a lot of the planning tools and goals that we have, policy goals that we have today, as we're working specifically in this project that follows on the case of Barcelona. We've put up a series of tools and goals that have been set out by Barcelona in itself on the neighborhood scale, on the city scale, on the metropolitan scale, and then within the context of Spain. In particular, the Nature 2030 plan outlines the importance of the green model and the importance of implementing ecological connectivity strategies in order to be able to enable inclusive green strategies, connected green strategies, and all of this with an aim of strengthening biodiversity within the city. So what we want is to move from a system of Barcelona in its metropolitan area. Here we have the city of Barcelona, which is currently functioning as such, to a system that has been enabled in order to capture carbon, but also function on a territorial scale. So to be able to do this, the first project that we're looking at is looking at partnering with ecosystem engineers in the design process. We use simulation in order to measure or foresee the likelihood of ecosystem engineers to thrive in the different territorial spaces, but also to foresee the consequences of their living in order to design their drive their produced impact towards designated solutions. So the first project is flower powder, and we're acting on agriculture-induced landscape fragmentation with the support of pollinators in a data-driven methodology. So what we've done is looked at the territory of Barcelona. This is the region of Catalonia. We have Barcelona down here, and this is El Vallès area. And basically, we've identified a series of abandoned agricultural plots that can be spaces where we can begin to work with enabling thriving ecological systems in order to ensure ecological connectivity on a larger scale. So we've done a simulation with Circuitscape, which you can see here on the left, and activated these identified abandoned crops that we saw previously as thriving ecological systems in order to identify what or how the ecological system as a whole could potentially work with these new connectivity axes. So fundamentally, the abandoned crops become positive ecosystem services and allow to create a transformation where the ecological system as a whole is thriving. Specifically, we work in the collaboration between society and ecology, working hand in hand with insect pollinators, implementing through policy change, but also through co-design and bottom-up strategies, a series of context-based changes in design, implementing strategies that would attract and ensure the well-being of insect pollinators within the area. In order to test this, we've identified a specifically interesting ecological corridor that is made up of a series of abandoned crops, where we can identify which are the very high or very low connectivity in the abandoned crops, and consequently identify which are the crops that we're particularly interested in working in. More specifically, these crops have different specific, very localized contexts, going from crops that are included within naturalized or forest areas to all the way to crops that are included within very urbanized contexts. So this obviously creates different conditions within which or with which to design. Through computational logics, we're able to identify which of the crops that would have the biggest impact on the ecological system as a whole, and therefore identifying where are the spaces that we will begin to work our interventions from, and consequently defining which are the ideal types of interventions for the specific localized contexts of these spaces. The interventions vary from the interventions work together with the adequation of the environment, the implementation of a series of nesting spaces, plantation, but also beekeeping strategies. And what we've done is we've started here with the actual sort of empty plots in order to implement a series of strategies to renew the health of the ecological systems within these empty plots. We also have interstitial spaces and community interventions that could help pollinators. So these are active crops, but how can we engage in the active crops? So not just transforming the abandoned crops, but also changing the way in which we behave within the active agricultural crops. What do the edge conditions look like, and how can they also enable the pollinators to be happy and functioning? We have the forest systems. So what does the forest system look like? How does it function? And how could we enable it to become a healthier forest system in alliance with the pollinator species? And finally, the more urbanized spaces, so infrastructural areas, but also urbanized plots, and what are the interventions that we can do within these spaces, potentially on a smaller scale, but that can further foment the connectivity of the ecological spaces. Finally, we've worked with the development of a series of guidelines for schools. Specifically, it's a space where there is a high level of educational spaces, therefore working with schools in order to implement a series of strategies to create not only awareness, but practical implementation of pollinator-friendly interventions within their outdoor spaces. So these include a series of how-to guides that the children and the instructors can work together with. The second project that we're looking at is also looking at simulating as a tool, working together with ecosystem engineers. Here we're specifically working together with red squirrels, within the context of Madrid in Spain once again, and fostering the behavioral traits of red squirrels in order to collaboratively reforest the area of Madrid. So as you may or may not know, there is a tale in Spain that says that once Spain could be entirely crossed by squirrels because Spain was an incredibly intense forest region. Today, however, in the Madrid area of Spain, at least, we've had a lot of forest loss. And as you can see here, we have the changing tree cover of these areas, as well as the green spaces within Madrid. So this has an impact fundamentally where we've had forest loss as a, in some way, condition to urbanization, which also obviously has an impact on climate change. And within the city areas, it has a huge impact on urban heat island effect. So from the forest loss, we have a habitat loss, we suffer a decrease in biodiversity, and this obviously impacts the loss of species. So by working together with red squirrels as green allies, we have the possibility, by fostering their behavior as animals who collect seeds and store them underground, and often they actually forget where they store them. They overstore, and there's accidental germination. So this can potentially, by fostering the proliferation of this species behavioral traits, we can ensure in some way or enable the regeneration of woodland. So specifically what we're interested in is understanding how we can enable this behavior of the squirrels in areas that are particularly impacted by urban heat island effect. So in order to be able to understand where those spaces might be, we've on one side measured the urban heat island effect in Madrid, and on the other side we've looked at the NDVI, so the normalized difference vegetation index within the area of Madrid, to be able to understand where the forest spaces are healthier and where they are not. This allows us to identify 3 different typological areas. One where we have healthy forests and low urban heat island effect. One where we have not healthy forests, meaning almost no vegetation and low urban heat island effect. And one where we have high urban heat island effect and, again, low vegetation. So how we can connect this space to this space through this space. So here we look at the specific conditions and we try to understand what are the typologies of spaces, working with grasslands, so not just forest areas, but vineyards, scrubs, parks, grasslands, all the way to other types of green spaces that have, for example, more urban related or anthropocenic functions, such as open plots or parking spaces. With the implementation of the circuitscape analysis, we're able to understand how we can implement the connectivity between the external forest patches and the internal spaces in the city, and what are the spaces that will have the most impact on the well-being of the full system. In parallel, of course, we're looking into the possibility of working with native trees in Madrid, but also trees that will in some way work together with the behaviors of the squirrel, so working with nuts and berries, and selecting a series of tree typologies in order to enable this proliferation. These trees have specific ecological functions, which we can then use to identify or foresee what the future of Madrid could be. So the master plan in some way is an open-ended plan where we can begin to work with certain surfaces, for example, within the city, that allow for permeability rather than closing them off, that allow the ground to become porous, and that allow us to embed a series of starter kit trees that then the squirrels can foster for their behavioral traits and further implement the growth of these species within the urban context. From the side of the smaller scale intervention, of course, it's important to be able to embed productive ecologies within the deeper urban context. So not just connecting the exterior forest patches, but also working from the inside of the city out towards the other forest patches. So it's a pleasure for me to present quickly one of the interventions that IAC has developed called Comida, which is a co-designed urban green element that enables to produce food and energy. So Comida is an intelligent vertical modular system for the cultivation of edible plants, that has been co-designed together with the citizens. It was a project that was funded by Bit Habitat, which is a local funding scheme in Barcelona. So the project is based on, as I was mentioning, a co-design process that was enabled by my colleagues here at IAC. And they worked together with the citizens to understand what were on one side the plants that made the most sense for them to work with, but also how the system, or what were their expectations that this system could potentially host in terms of other potential ecosystem services. Here we see the wonderful Chiara Farinea, whom you will all have a chance to meet if you haven't already. And what we can see here is the implementation of the finalized prototype. So obviously through the process of co-design, the system was designed and understood what were the important elements. The system has been built, materialized through 3D printing with clay. So of course there was an interest to work with natural materials that also have thermal properties that can also adapt. And the technology of 3D printing enables us to customize each and every single of the elements that then produce the system as a whole. So here what we can see is the system as a whole. As was mentioned before, the system not only produces food, but it also enables to produce energy, specifically working with the production of biophotovoltaic energy, a very simplified version of what biophotovoltaic energy is fundamentally plants, when they go through the process of photosynthesis, they produce a series of bacteria in their roots. With the implementation of an anode, in this case carbon fiber, and a cathode, we are able to collect this bacteria that is produced in the roots in the soil as electrons in order to create a small electrical charge. So this energy is used to activate the watering system and the monitoring system for the entire wall. So as I was saying, there is a monitoring system based on a sensor system that allows us to understand the humidity, temperature, but also the energy being produced. And this enables the system to be activated in order to implement the watering system. This is a full ecological system. So the wall hosts birds and bats and insects. So each of the pieces are designed to be able to host these different species, but also the cultivation of plants, as well as embedding microbiota. The design is also designed to optimize the canalization of the water, and we have, of course, some management units for the technology that's implemented within this system. This is a more recent picture of the system where we start to see the microbiota and the plants really growing, the people actively collaborating. And as I was saying before, the idea is that we look at how we can create small-scale interventions within the city, potentially understanding where they could be located. So in Barcelona, we have a lot of blank facades. So how could we implement these further? And also how these could then multiply their impact within the context of the larger scale territorial system. So each of these small interventions then enable the system to function more healthily and thrive as a whole. With that, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to also make a shout out to my colleagues, particularly those who worked on the Comida project, as well as all of the students who contributed in the development of the projects that were discussed earlier. Thank you very much for your attention and have a lovely day or evening.